Now we talk about how Africa stands to gain from Asia and what it can do differently in these difficult and interesting times. We're joined now by Economies Lead at Oxfam Africa, Francis Agbere, to speak about the summit. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
So this is the ninth TICAD summit. Let's look back at, since its establishment, what has changed and what has been of benefit for Africa to work alongside Japan in terms of trade relations, and is it different to the relationship that it has to the United States and China, for instance?
Yeah, once again, thanks for raising this very important topic. I'll say that first and foremost, we must appreciate that whilst there's a lot of potential with conferences like this, that is also important that we appreciate that we don't have constant issues that do not change, right? Because our challenges keep on changing. And therefore, we must begin to approach some of these challenges with solutions that are evolving over time. If you look at the way TCAD has evolved over the years, in the context of all of these issues that you have mentioned, the recognition is that there has been quite a focus on dealing with some of the key issues that Africa has been calling for. So, for example, if you take the issues around supporting stronger health systems, if you take the issues around supporting the growth of business, but then also, most importantly, around how we can transform, the industrial base of Africa. So some of these issues, in our estimation, have been touched on. However, there are also opportunities that have come down the line. So, for example, in the context of trade, you notice that the AfCFTA presents real opportunities, but then it also points us to something that we have failed really to embark on partnership drives that really are working for our own, cross-border trading, as an example, which is why we are around 50% in terms of how we're able to trade amongst ourselves, and why the likes of Asia as a region are doing roughly 60% and above. So that raises a critical question that we need to answer. Also, given the fact that we have been investing both in terms of time and resources in exchanging as relates to the TCAD, for example. I also note that some of the key issues that have been part of what TCAD has looked at would center more around strengthening entrepreneurship amongst youth and so on and so forth, but also putting a spotlight on technology and its development and so on and so forth, because we know how strong, for example, the semiconductor industry is in Asia. So these are some of the key issues in our assessment that seem to be evolving. But like I said, we must understand where we are at the moment in terms of the challenges that we are faced with,
So
and
let's
whether.
talk about where we are at the moment in terms of those challenges. As I mentioned, President Ramaphosa raising the need to diversify export markets. What Japan is saying now at TICAD is that it wants to engage more, invest capital in, for instance, infrastructure, investment, as well as industrialization, technological advancements. You mentioned the AfCFTA. Surely these are things that would be complementary in Africa's pursuit for better intra-Africa trade.
Yeah, absolutely. But we do think that it must not end there, but that we must look at where are we getting the capital from to facilitate that, and what is the status quo. our assessment is that currently part of the challenges we face as a continent is a question of money, and money to be able to drive businesses, strengthen, for example, MSMEs, to be able to build the resilience needed to compete, because you're dealing with massive, multinational companies that have a lot of capital. And so I think the conversation around trade would also require that we look into the question of capital. For example, much earlier this year, ahead of the launch of G20, ex-presidents of Africa made a fervent call, and it was to ensure that we were able to lower the cost of borrowing, as an example. That we were able to really deal also with the crisis of debt that we have in our hands. And until we're able to really address some of these structural issues, I'm afraid it will be difficult to really deal with, the critical issues that we are faced with, and to facilitate and promote the trade that we need.
So let
And
me
therefore,
ask
I
this
think,
question then more pointedly. Is Japan an ally if we're saying Africa needs to have a greater voice and we need to reform the unfair international financial architecture?
yeah, absolutely. We do have friends, and I would say that over the past 30 years, countries like Japan have played a critical role. And I think that is also the starting point, that we must acknowledge that. And so cooperation through the likes of Japan and allies that we have should be one of our priority points, as it were, that we can harvest basically as a continent to be able to drive that agenda. And so I think an entry point would be to leverage on the technological expertise and leadership, of Japan. For example, today you have AI that presents significant capabilities. You have experiences around building infrastructure and so on and so forth. So being able to tap into that competency, that groundswell of expertise from Japan, that strengthens local ownership, as opposed to just saying, look, we want to partner with you. But there has to be that priority on skills transfer, on tech transfer, to be able to ensure that we are anchoring our industries in a way that works for us. And I think that partnership would be important in having not only with Japan, but also other development partners with whom we collaborate as a continent, both within Asia and beyond.
Yeah, Francis, I'm not sure what's happening with your sound. If you've mistakenly muted yourself, but let's continue with what has been unveiled, what has been suggested there in Tokyo at TICAD. There is a suggestion of an economic zone linking the Indian Ocean to Africa that will seek a greater role in the region. How would that better benefit us?
Yes, I assume you're talking about the Lobito corridor. I do believe that one of the key things we must appreciate when it comes to the way we are able to facilitate cross-border engagement, partnerships, and so on, would require that we're able to build the linkages in terms of transportation nodes. The corridor proposes some of those things through railway infrastructure, through road infrastructure, and a host of others. But the big question that we pose as Oxfam is, to what extent are all of those investments dispossessing, local people who are on the ground, who will be impacted frontline by some of those investments? To what extent are those discussions involving you and I as a common person, say in Angola or Zambia or in South Africa and so on and so forth. To what extent is it ensuring that at the end of the day, all of the tech that will be deployed there, all of the resources that will come there, that local workers are able to benefit from it and to be able to secure what we call a living income from all of the investments and so on and so forth, because I assume that you wouldn't have such huge investments without engaging local contractors, as an example. And that should be a key area of concern for us. It is important that we pay closer attention to that, not just investments like the Lobito corridor, which will upscale our acceleration more or less towards a green economy, but most importantly, other private sector related investments. And
So what
yeah.
would say the International Financial Finance Corporation, for instance, because they also were part of the talks. We made the presentation about the Indian Ocean Africa Economic Zone. What would they be pushing for the Yokohama Declaration at the end of this week that will safeguard Africa from these nations through loan projects gaining a greater foothold onto the African continent and, as you say, endangering ownership heritage of African peoples?
Yeah, indeed. I think that foremost would be the need to strengthen partnerships, right? But partnership to mobilize capital, because you realize that the private sector essentially are able to move in quite loads of resources. But outside of that, we must also appreciate that we need, for instance, to be able to have a rules-based system that is able to keep private sector in check. For example, in safeguarding some of the activities around their business model. And I think that is really important, an area that would be instrumental for us to take keen interest in. I appreciate that one of the challenges, and I think I had mentioned it much earlier, that we face is that we are faced with a crunch in terms of our budget latitude as
Okay.
countries, within the continent. And so we would obviously look for resources elsewhere. But there is an existing regime that makes it significantly difficult for us to be able to get the best out of that. And so therefore, where you have private sector involved, as I said, we should be prioritizing safeguards that are making such decisions, such discussions with them in terms of the flow of capital more
All
transparent,
right.
that it's also one that is based on a business model that supports inclusive development, that addresses the questions of inequality that we have been faced with as a continent. And it'll be
Francis, we're going to have
important.
to end it there, I'm afraid, but I do appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Francis Agbere is Economies Lead at Oxfam Africa, just reflecting on the TICAD meeting taking place in Yokohama in Japan at the moment. It's the ninth iteration.